We are at a watershed moment. Israel's threat to annex parts of the occupied West Bank has alarmed Palestinians, many Israelis, and the broader international community. If implemented, annexation would constitute the most serious violation of international law, grievously harm the prospect of a two-state solution. I call on the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That's the sound of growing desperation and discontent. Palestinian and pro-peace Israelis demanding the Israeli government and the White House reverse a Middle East deal. We won't call it a peace deal. It is designed by President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, which should tell you everything because he's certainly no expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has never wanted a Palestinian state next to Israel, and he's called it the ultimate deal. Next to President Trump, who, of course, never one to miss a chance to self-indulge, said he had succeeded where other presidents had failed.
All prior administrations from President Lyndon Johnson have tried and bitterly failed. But I was not elected to do small things. On Sunday, I delivered to Prime Minister Netanyahu my vision for peace.
Too many plans tried to pressure Israel to withdraw from vital territory like the Jordan Valley. But you, Mr. President, you recognized that Israel must have sovereignty in the Jordan Valley and the other strategic areas of Judea and Samaria.
Oh, and there were no Palestinian leaders at the White House press conference because they call it a steal of the century. A land steal where Israel could annex, which is a nice word for illegally seize, up to 30% of Palestinian land in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. Now, I was a correspondent in Jerusalem during the 90s and beyond, when there was a real peace process called the Oslo Accords. But then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, shot in the back at a peace rally in Tel Aviv by a Jewish extremist.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
And Palestinian extremists set off a series of bus bombs, killing Israelis in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And I was back again in the West Bank during the siege of Yasser Arafat's compound, where the car I was driving came under heavy gunfire by Israeli soldiers, despite it being marked in bold lettering, TV. As a journalist, I have been tear-gassed and dodged stones and even Cobra helicopters firing 30-millimeter chain guns into Ramallah. Israelis and Palestinians have rocked each other's worlds with tragic violence. And I think Palestinians and neighboring Arab countries will never swallow what's on the table right now. Not this deal. Never. But hey, don't take my word for it. On this backstory, a range of views on the Israeli annexation scheme, the deal or the steal of the century. All right, journalist Nurit Ben has covered the peace process, if you want to call it that, for a long time, and she's a very experienced journalist from Israel. Nurit, can you tell me, first of all, what do we call this deal? It is not a peace deal.
Right. I don't think you could call it a deal. We hasn't been able to be described as a deal for a long time. I mean, as you know, in the very beginning, President Donald Trump called it the deal of the century. Then exactly a year ago, when I was in Bahrain covering the first unveiling, the Peace for Prosperity, this economic first part, they switched the rhetoric, I think, very intentionally to call it the opportunity of the century. And at this point, I don't know what we can call it at all. It really is sort of an idea or a vision. But it's really at a point of irrelevance, I think, at this point. I mean, the Palestinians cut off all ties with the United States, with the White House about 2 years ago now, during the embassy move. They have no interest, in hearing about it and speaking about it, much less sitting down at an actual table together And in any other way, it hasn't really advanced. And then if annexation does move forward in any way, I think that will really put out the final embers.
So let's talk about it in terms of, let's give the White House, Jared Kushner and the president the benefit of the doubt for a minute, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and say, okay, they have a real proposal, and the proposal is what? We're going to annex up to 30% of Palestinian land, and they get what in return, and why would this ever work?
Well, why it would ever work, I don't want to speak for them. It would allow Israel, as you say, to extend sovereignty to about 30% of the West Bank, including all settlements in the Jordan Valley. And then there would be sort of the rest reserved for Palestinians for a set period, I believe about 4 years, in which they would be expected to meet a certain set of conditions, stopping incitement, stopping stipends to terrorists, giving citizens full civil rights, and so on and so forth. But honestly, nobody's going to get that far.
All right. Well, when I heard about it, after covering Oslo, where the Palestinians were offered Jerusalem as a homeland, they were offered a continuous piece of land in the West Bank. They were offered continuing negotiations on either right of return of millions now of Palestinians that were pushed out in 48 and 67, or some kind of compensation, and the latter being the more likely. What are they getting out of this? I really don't understand. Some kind of economic boost, or what are they trying to sell them?
Well, I think that was the way the Trump administration saw it. And again, I think the real economic part of it that I saw the most up close was, again, in Bahrain, where they were trying to unveil this economic part. And you had prominent ambassadors from Arab Gulf states. You had some Palestinians flying under the radar and so on. And the real mentality was, look, nothing has worked so far. You have a lot to gain economically, that economics needs to precede peace. That obviously the economic situation in the West Bank is bad, in Gaza disastrous. And their perspective was it was a sort of regional picture of, once again, that they could finally, because of the warming ties between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, because of the sort of impatience in the Gulf Arab states who say, behind the scenes, well, you know what, we don't have so much patience for a deal. We don't have patience for the Palestinians anymore. We want to take a step forward. We want to help them, but we also want to benefit from whatever cooperation we can get with Israel. And so I think that was part of their fundamental argument is, the train is leaving the station. You stand a lot to gain from it. So come sit down and talk. But as we see, nothing has so far come out of that.
I think the Palestinians are not going to be dragged in behind that train if they're unwilling to go. So can we just separate the president and American interests and Netanyahu for a minute? And from the American side, why would they support something that's kind of a non-starter? Is it because they can? Right. Do you think that there's political theater there coming up to an election in the U.S. and they can say, we have a Middle East peace deal?
Well, I think that there's a few parts to that answer. First of all, I think that the reason this is being discussed in Washington now, and we've seen this week all these conversations behind the scenes with all the people involved, including U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is because Netanyahu has, since the reveal in January, made this an issue. He's been pushing it more and more. So it's sort of pushed the Trump administration to sit down and think, well, what do we agree to? What do we not agree to? That being said, there seems to be a split within the administration itself. From what I understand, there's Jared Kushner, senior advisor to the president, who has been a key part of this deal and has been really working the Gulf angle, quite a bit throughout, who sees annexation as part of this broader deal that was laid out, sees it as leverage that could be used to get eventually the Palestinians to make concessions, to come to the table, and so forth. And then there's Ambassador David Friedman, who's a big proponent of settlements and who seems to be pushing this far more aggressively. As far as President Trump himself, I, like you, and I think every other journalist, wouldn't presume to know what he's thinking or what his plans are. I don't really see what is in it for him, because other than distraction, as you mentioned, which of course is a valid point. Domestic distraction can always be.
Well, I think he needs some international boost, whether it be in the Baltics with the Serbs in Kosovo, which he's not going to get now, or maybe a Middle East peace deal. So maybe that would have helped him. And Jared, Kushner.
If we're talking about a deal, absolutely. He certainly wanted the victory of being the first president to actually achieve some real form of Middle East peace. Sure.
But they rolled it out. They rolled it out as a deal. There was the theater minus the Palestinians, which
Right.
was a pretty big hole. But there was the theater of that news conference in Washington where they said, we have this is historic. I mean,
absolutely. All of that theater aside, what I'm speaking about, and I think you're talking about the deal, and I'm moving on to speak about even just annexation, because I think the political theater that they've managed to get out of the deal has maybe come to an end. I mean, we saw the reveal with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the same room with prominent Gulf Arab ambassadors, taking the stage, taking the podium directly after President Trump, almost as if it was his, space in Jerusalem. That was, as you say, sort of the ultimate political theater and potentially a very good distraction for President Donald Trump in a way to put himself on the international stage. But when we get to this point, when the deal is no longer really a concrete discussion, even an annexation is, specifically from the discussions happening now in Washington, which are centered on annexation. What do we do about it? What do we say to Netanyahu? What do we greenlight? What do we not? For that, I mean, Trump, his evangelical base, which has been a key point in Israel, they're not too interested in annexation, not in the same way that they were in the embassy move. So,
all right, what about Netanyahu's base? Are they interested in annexation? Netanyahu is the right and has always been. He certainly needed this maybe before the election. You can talk about how much did he actually garner from that? But I mean, is this just playing to his base as well?
Netanyahu overall, I know you followed, all of this and been a correspondent in Jerusalem. You've probably seen various iterations of it because he has been the prominent public figure in Israel for so long. He's promised sweeping annexation time and again in election cycles. It plays ideally to his base, the right wing, the further right wing, the settler movements. It never materializes. He's never fulfilled those sweeping annexation promises. This time, after January, when the peace plan was revealed, and Netanyahu sort of immediately took it as an opportunity to announce, hey, this is the green light, we have to do it. It does feel a little bit different. You could say Israel is in a perpetual election cycle, 3 in about a year. So, they're always looking towards the next, and it's currently in a very fragile government. So that is one piece. It's always there. And the other part might be legacy. Netanyahu, I think, is very much also looking towards his legacy within his own country, towards his own base. And this may be part of it for him.
I'm curious about the Israeli left, if I can just very quickly touch on it, because there was a real peace movement in the 90s when Yitzhak Rabin came out and announced Oslo I and Oslo II. And prior to the assassination, there was real hope. And, we witnessed the redeployment of troops out of Bethlehem and Jericho and Ramallah. And suddenly Palestinian kids weren't coming out and throwing stones at Israeli soldiers anymore. There was this real moment and this breath of, maybe these people can live beside each other, and this is going to work. And then spiraling down into violence of the bus bombs, and then another intifada, which became far more violent than anything we had ever seen before. Is the Israeli left still hanging in there, or are they so despondent and disappointed with the original process that they think you can never arm a Palestinian, if you want to call it a state, a two-state solution? It'll never work because they're fundamentally, philosophically against the state of Israel.
I think the Israeli left is definitely still hanging in there in terms of ideology. There's certainly a belief that Israel itself, that the Israeli people cannot have a solid future without a two-state solution, something that is less and less popular in general, that is less and less spoken of in general. I would say that it's the left itself that in the broader political map has shrunken so substantially, because as you point to, I mean, really after the second intifada, it served to just kill, all these ideas that in retrospect seem, ridiculous and naive. Here's the moderate, the left wing saying, look, we can have peace. Look, we made these great strides and this is going to open up a different future. And the second intifada, and I mean, the daily suicide bombs, the sheer amount of fear and death there, really served in retrospect is what I think is the death blow.
And I think, you and I take for granted that a lot of people remember these things. But I mean, bus bombs on Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv.
Every single day. I mean, there was not one day where people didn't wake up to that.
I mean, the violence was as terrible and inhuman as it gets, really, I think.
Yeah. I mean, true. And everywhere, in shopping malls in Tel Aviv and clubs, across the country, no place was safe. And that was obviously a massive national collective trauma. I mean, I'm American. I was born and raised in the United States. So I had, a family here, but I watched it from abroad. So I can't say I lived through it. I certainly saw the impact it had, culture-wise. And every morning you turn on the TV, there was a different bus bomb. I think over time also...
I covered it, and I can tell you as a correspondent, it was, some of it was just, horrible. And these are not Israeli soldiers against Palestinian armed men. I mean, these are, grandfathers and grandmothers and kids in cafes. And I mean, it's, I think it's just disgusting violence, and you can't justify it in any way. But I mean, but the Palestinians have suffered violence on their side. So when we come back to annexation, if it is forced through and Netanyahu tries to physically move on the ground in annexation, do you think that will, first of all, I want to ask you about the Palestinians, will that usher in a new period, do you think, of violence and a new intifada, perhaps, if you want to call it that? Yeah. And how will Egypt and Jordan and the neighbors next to Israel react to that as well?
Well, so on the Palestinian side, in terms of violence, I think there's two sort of things to look at. There's the very initial, what's going to happen in the immediate aftermath. If, let's say, even a smaller version of annexation is approved by the Trump administration, because an important note, it will not go forward. The Israeli government will not go forward without a green light from the administration. And then there's the bigger, more long-term picture and context. In terms of the immediate violence, I mean, I've talked to, in the last few days, several different Palestinians, former ministers and officials. I honestly don't think anybody knows, even the Palestinians or Israeli security officials, exactly what to predict. I think it's safe to say it would be an immediate, very volatile period. Demonstrations for sure. The degree to which those demonstrations become violent, as you know, depends on so many different factors, because the way one thing starts in this region can snowball very quickly into something very different. It's a tinderbox. Absolutely. And the smallest thing or misinterpretation or a death can obviously snowball into something totally different. I think an important thing to watch in terms of violence is Hamas, actually, because Hamas, for those who aren't familiar with this, with all the very complicated internal politics also within the Palestinians, a bitter rival of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority that rules the West Bank. They have every reason the more moderate authority.
Absolutely. Fatah versus.
Absolutely. And Hamas has every reason to try to take advantage of a situation like this. They have a presence in the West Bank in places like Hebron to sort of try to sow some chaos, try to push the Palestinian Authority even further into a corner. So that's a factor to watch. And then there's the backdrop as well in terms of the tinderbox that you mentioned. And that's that the Palestinian Authority, I think it was in May, just about a month ago, moved to cut off all its agreements with Israel. And there are many. I mean, there are many active agreements between Israel and the West Bank that really help run the day-to-day in security and otherwise. And part of that is deciding to no longer accept the tax money that Israel collects on their behalf. So Israel passes on this tax money, and then the Palestinian Authority uses that money to pay its people's salaries. So the moment they say, we're not even accepting the money from Israel, they can no longer pay salaries. And we've seen before, they've attempted it before, it wasn't really successful. It obviously causes an enormous amount of distress on the Palestinian public as well, because they need to get paid, they need to eat. And of course, we're talking about coming out of a global pandemic where, tourism is zero in Bethlehem and Ramallah and so on. So I think that only serves to show how much more it could be a tinderbox. But again, it's very difficult to predict.
All right. And very quickly, Egypt, Jordan.
Jordan, I think, is almost as important, if not more, to watch than the West Bank itself. I mean, we've seen they've already spoken out very strongly. The king said that they would withdraw ambassadors, that they would even consider scaling back the peace treaty. Jordan is certainly in a position to spearhead very strong international diplomacy against it, more so than the Palestinians, I think. It's a U.S. ally. And of course, Jordan also has about 2 million Palestinians living there. And so also violence within Jordan, on the streets of Jordan, also putting pressure on the Jordanian king is certainly something to watch. Egypt has been relatively silent so far, but I can't see that a step like this, even for those nations that don't have a peace treaty like Egypt with Israel, but who have been getting closer and closer to Israel, some of those Gulf nations, very hard for me to see them being able to, keep silent and not really pose a united front if something like this happens.
Well, that's some kind of deal they're talking about, this annexation.
Yeah.
I tell you. Nurit Ben, great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dana.
Joining me now from Jericho, which is, if you didn't know, is in the Jordan Valley, is Saeb Erekat, the Secretary General of the PLO Executive. He is one of the recognizable voices of the Palestinian struggle for a homeland for decades. Saeb, you must be tired of all this.
I can't be tired. I can't be tired. It's about life or death. 3 days ago, I buried my nephew, 26-year-old, who was shot and killed by the Israelis in cold blood. If I get tired, it means more of the same. It means that the cycle of violence and killing will continue. And the only way to stop this is to end this tragic situation is through peace and through the two-state solution. So how can someone get tired of trying to save the lives of his children and his grandchildren?
I saw the video of your nephew as the car ran into the Israeli checkpoint. And first of all, let me say, I'm very sorry for your loss. I mean, he was a young man. Was he 28?
He was 26, and he was going to Bethlehem to bring his sister from the coiffeur, the salon, in her wedding day, 23rd of June, between 7 and 10 p.m. And if you notice the video, the car strayed. It was going 5 kilometers an hour. And then Ahmed tried to leave the car, if you see the video. And he left the car, raised his hands, tried to speak to them, but they did not give him a chance. They shot him 5 times and killed him in cold blood. And no one of them was threatened at that time. And I'm sure that Ahmed, something went wrong with the car, the rented car. And would someone go and commit a suicide on the day of his daughter's sister's wedding? Would someone promising as Ahmed, who has a renting company and so on? It's just they kill with impunity. And then, if as a Palestinian today, I cannot make a mistake. If I pass a soldier, I cannot put my hand in my pocket because he may shoot me, suspecting that I'm bringing something. I cannot fall. I cannot make any mistake. I cannot do anything. It's just trigger happy killers in the roadblocks.
Well, I guess the Israelis would say that that to them seemed like an attack on their post. But regardless, I mean, this shows the way the two sides view each other. I mean, what one side views one as a potential suicide bomber every time they come in contact with a Palestinian, and Palestinians view Israeli soldiers as somebody that will turn a gun on them and pull the trigger.
They act with impunity. It's not, of course it's personal. He's my nephew. This is the second nephew I lose in 3 years.
Okay, let's turn the clock. Let's talk about the peace process. Because when I met you in the 90s, people don't realize now. I mean, there's already another generation or two. Suddenly, look, every day we used to go out and cover Israelis firing rubber bullets at Palestinians, Palestinian kids coming out of school, throwing stones and getting shot, and some would die and some were mortally injured. And suddenly you were the chief negotiator on a peace process called the Oslo Peace Accords. And Israeli troops pulled out of, and this may seem like a distant memory, but I mean, Israeli troops left Gaza to a large degree. They left Jericho, Hebron, Nablus, Bethlehem. And suddenly Palestinian kids, I remember, came out of school and they played games instead of throwing stones and in confrontations with Israeli soldiers. It was an extremely promising time. Doesn't it disappoint you? All these years later, we are still so far away from actually realizing a real peace process where the two sides are divorced.
I agree with you. I don't think we have been in a much worse situation than we are now as Palestinians and Israelis, and I'm afraid that's going to get worse due to the fact that the agreements reached with the Israelis in the 90s were not implemented. Settlement activities continued, and then it was culminated by an administration in the U.S. headed by people like Kushner and Greenblatt and Friedman, who believe that this issue is not for negotiations. God decided, they said, all the issues, and they came with this idea without, I saw it like you did on TV about my future, and they wanted to impose and dictate on me, Jerusalem is Israel's capital, no refugees, no borders, no self-determination, no state, nothing. And that's the tragedy. The tragedy at the end of the day is going to end when Palestinians and Israelis sit on the table in accordance with the terms of reference agreed between the two sides. Sit to end that.
What do you call Jared Kushner's, Netanyahu, Trump's so-called deal that you didn't participate in? How would you characterize it?
I read every word of it, and I met these people, Kushner and his team and President Trump 37 times in 2017. They never shared anything with me. I shared everything with them. And they're a group of ideologues who believe that Palestinians are not people with national rights. They should be subjugated to Israel. They should be living in enclaves. And Israel should control their airspace, their territorial water, their international passages, their roads, their futures, their land, their natural resources. And they don't realize that we are 99% literacy rate as Palestinians, 2020. We have the highest PhD, master's, bachelor's holders as per capita. And yet they're trying to impose on us now. It's not a plan of peace. It's a plan of apartheid, of what I call one state, two systems. Plan that is attempting not to learn the lessons of history. When you come to annexations. So what happened when Algeria annexed France for 130 years? What happened when Iraq annexed Kuwait in 1991? Annexation has been with those politically blind leaders who thought that power can get them the results they want.
And what did they offer you in return? What did they offer you in return? Some kind of financial prosperity and a buyout?
No, they want me to join the Zionist movement in return. They put 10 conditions on me that I have to accept that from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, it's the Jewish historic land. They want to deny the fact that, I'm speaking to you from Jericho, I'm 11,000 years old. I was here 5,600 years before Yeshua ben Nun brought these Egyptians and came and built my town, Jericho. I have my own narrative. I'm not asking them to believe in my narrative or to adopt my narrative or my story or my history or my religion, but they should respect me. Now with this, with the fact that it's written in this agreement by Kushner, that from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, it's the Jewish historic land. I'm an alien in my land. I'm an alien in my house. And then they say they have the overriding security responsibility. And they say I have nothing to do with Jerusalem. It's their capital. I have nothing to do with refugees. That nothing is going to be in my hand. That's what they say. And at the end of the day, that's what they want me to do. And if I don't do that, I don't want to negotiate. I want conflict. I want peace. They use everything against me. And the heartless, I don't know, when you have people around the world saying that we share the same values. What values? What values do you share? When someone like Pompeo say, I walk with Jesus to recognize settlements. Jesus, this is not who Jesus is. This is not who Jesus is. Jesus is for life. Jesus cares for the lives of Palestinians, Israelis, Africans, Latins. Jesus is peace.
All right. So
he's the Prince of Peace. He's not the Prince of God.
They are going to announce not a peace deal, not a negotiated anything, an imposed annexation, which would carve out, as you understand it, Palestinian villages, which would remain as Palestinian enclaves. Israel would apply some sovereignty over them. You won't get to vote in Israel, obviously, because you're not going to become part of Israel. It sounds like Swiss cheese, where you do not get this continuous piece of land, which would be a Palestinian state, because that's what you wanted.
It's true. That's what the map they offered. That's what they showed. That's what they want. They said, even Netanyahu made an interview in Israel Hayom in Israeli newspapers last month, and he said, look, Palestinians must understand that they will live in enclaves. He said that. And
so an enclave, let's define an enclave. Sorry, Saeb, to interrupt you.
An enclave is Bantos towns, trying to get you the map.
But essentially, you have the West Bank territory, and an enclave would just be kind of a little island surrounded by Israeli roads, Israeli patrolled roads, Israeli soldiers, much like you are now.
No, I'm better now. I'm much better now. That's the irony, with the Oslo Accords, we have 3 contractual agreements that specified 6 issues that will be negotiated between the two sides: Jerusalem border settlement, refugees, water security. And then we said, upon the inauguration of the council, 18 months, all West Bank and Gaza Strip territory will become under my jurisdiction, except for issues to be negotiated permanent status. What they're doing now is saying, forget about UN, forget about international law. There is a new game in town. You were defeated. You must come to your knees and accept Israel won, and you will live here as we want you to live. We will decide your way of eating, drinking, studying, education, roads. You have no right to self-determination. You're not a people. That's what they're telling me. And what this will do? This will do one thing. If they annex anything, it means the moderates like myself, who recognize the Israel right to live in peace and security, who want to make peace through peaceful means, no violence, who accepted resolutions 242 and 338, will play the disappearing act. And then, as you said, now it's a generational changes now. So many in the Palestinian young community, which is the majority now, okay, they say, look, you don't want two states? Let's see if we can entertain the idea of one state, equal rights. Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live as equals. Oh, once you say this, it's like throwing a nuclear bomb in Israel, because they want to say Jewish democratic state. How can you have a Jewish democratic state when today I, Saeb, Erekat, the Christian, Muslim, Palestinian, from my hometown Jericho on the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, I am 50.9% of the population. Friedman and Netanyahu are 49.1% of the population. How can you just think of people who are trying to impose a 21st century apartheid, segregation, and subjugation of Palestinians?
All right, can I just ask you from the Israeli side? The Oslo Peace Accords allowed you to arm, to patrol your own areas.
Yes.
And then suddenly, look, I was there between Israeli soldiers and Ramallah when it started falling apart. I was literally crawling on my hands and knees and on my chest when Palestinians opened fire after Israelis had opened fire. And, I don't know who fired the first shot that day, but it rapidly unraveled to the point that, fast forward in the months and years, Israelis say, the left-wing Israelis who really believed in a peace process and don't want to be in the West Bank and don't want Gaza, they said, okay, you can never arm these people because all we got were bullets and bus bombs in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. And that left wing really has largely evaporated, has it not? The peace movement inside Israel has evaporated, feeling greatly disenchanted with the idea that they would ever live side by side with a Palestinian state, especially an armed one.
And that's what you get. Netanyahu in 1993, when we signed the Oslo Accord, he stood up in front of a picture of Rabin, the prime minister at that time, put a keffiyeh in his head, and he said, if it's the last thing I'll do, I will bury this shameful agreement. Netanyahu is not a two-stater. So everything he did in his life was to destroy the two-state solution. He's a man, I know him for 33 years. And if I want to sum him up for you, I will tell you two things. One, he believes that there was no past before him and there will be no future without him. It's the ME syndrome, ME. That's what counts in his life. Secondly, ideologically, he believes that Israel is much more powerful and prosperous in conflict, not in peace. And when you have an American president who's his main ally, who also has a doctrine, President Trump, that nations either born to be strong or to find strong nations to protect them at the right price. The jungle has a law, chaos has order. But if you combine Netanyahu's doctrine with Trump's doctrine, what do you get? What do you get?
Do you think, and I remember those days because it's important what you say, because there were posters all over Jerusalem with Yitzhak Rabin in like the Arafat keffiyeh, and they were saying he was I think in Hebrew they said it was Din Rodef, and that was why that's largely what led to his assassination and the turning back of the peace process, even though Netanyahu said he would never turn the clock back on the peace process. There was no way of doing it. But in fact, he managed to turn the peace process back on its heels. Do you believe if there was another leader, if Rabin had lived, do you think that Oslo would have been implemented and we would be at a much different place than we are today?
If Rabin had lived, we would have peace by now. We'd have two-state solution. If Olmert wasn't taken to jail and accused of these accusations, we would have had a peace. And every time an Israeli leader moves towards the reality of two states, somehow they make him disappear.
So very quickly, if you could just answer kind of yes and no, so we can just run through the list. Access to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the Palestinian capital in this deal?
No.
A right of return or some compensation for refugees?
No.
A continuous piece of land, a homeland for Palestinians that go back to probably the 67 borders, including Gaza, with some kind of connection to Gaza?
No.
So what's in it for you?
Surrender. And
Surrender.
They call it peace based on the truth. And actually, he wants to destroy people like me and like Abu Mazen and like the Palestinian peace camp who want to live and let live, who have recognized the state of Israel right to live in peace and security. And 78% of historic British mandated Palestine accepted to have a state on 22% of the land, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. He can't stand us. They can't stand us. Because what do they say about us? We're a people who want to achieve peace through negotiations, non-violence, through the help of the international community. We want democracy, human rights, women's rights, the rule of law. So he really wants to execute all of us. He wants to execute the idea that peace is possible between Palestinians and Israelis. And when someone like the ambassador, Friedman, who says it's not us who recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, it's God. So Judaism was never a threat to us as Palestinians. It's never a threat, will never be a threat. Judaism is one of God's great religions. So in the 21st century, when a group of people come to you and tell you that this is a religious conflict, what do you think they're doing? Don't you think that in my side I have some people who refuse to shake my hand because I recognize Israel? Because I want to negotiate with Israel? And they insist in turning it into a religious conflict. This is not a religious conflict. Religion is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are for peace, saving lives. You know, our conflict is territorial differences, narratives, national, and can be solved through negotiations. But this group of people, I mean, Israel, since 2017, they don't have national negotiators anymore. You know, in the past, I used to call my colleagues, my counterparts.
They say you don't negotiate. They blame the Palestinians for not wanting to negotiate, for not accepting many deals that were put before them.
You know, that's that broken record they use. But ask in Israel, tell them who is your chief negotiator, who is the Israeli chief negotiator, who's Saeb Erekat's counterpart since 2017. They have none. They have none. Their chief negotiator is Friedman and Kushner. And in each meeting I had with Kushner, I urged him that he set me up with the Israelis, because I have no problem with the US. My problem is with the Israelis. I need to negotiate with the Israelis. And he refused. And then he just copied and pasted the most extremist positions of the settlers' councils and introduced it in the so-called plan of peace and prosperity. This group of people, this so-called American peace team, has put Palestinians and Israelis at least 50 to 60 years back.
Last question. It's always a tinderbox. Won't this cause another intifada or an uprising or more violence? I mean, it's not going to bring peace, is it?
It's not going to bring peace. It's going to bring more suffering for Palestinians and Israelis. They know, Palestinians will not accept to be subjugated, to live as slaves. Look, I was 12 years old. I was born in this house in Jericho. I was 12 years old when the occupation came to my hometown, Jericho. I'm 65 with 8 grandchildren now. Let's say they annex the Jordan Valley, as they say, 94%, and I'll be in enclave. What will change? Will I change my name? Will my grandchildren change their names? What will they do if they don't have hope in their minds, if they don't have the possibility of living in dignity and peace and freedom? All what I'm doing now is trying to keep the hope alive in the minds of Palestinians. All I'm telling Palestinians, don't despair. You're not alone. We can do it. But all what Kushner and Netanyahu and Trump are doing are telling Palestinians every day, no, don't listen to him. You will never be free. You will never have a state. You will never be independent. You'll never live in dignity. You will have to live as a subject to the Israelis, an apartheid system. Yes, we're different. That's what they're telling them. And do you think Palestinians will stand on lines to accept that? They will defend themselves. They will defend themselves.
Do you hope for a change? Do you hope for just a change of administration in the White House later this year? Would that at least get peace talks going?
Well, I saw a letter yesterday, actually, of 189 congressmen and women that said no to annexation and no to the Trump plan. I saw 32 senators doing this. I really appreciate this very much. I saw 222 Israeli generals, ex-generals, writing against annexation and against this and showing the dangers of this. I saw 192 nations worldwide standing shoulder to shoulder with me to say no to annexation, yes to negotiations, yes to this two-state solution. That gives me hope. But the time should come that these nations should tell Israel, should tell Netanyahu, if you move with the annexation, there'll be consequences. And that's what will stop him. But if he continues with the impunity, that he can do anything and get away with it, all right? He is not going to make peace. He's going to destroy any attempt to make peace with anyone. You know, annexation will mean the end of any possibility of a negotiated agreement between Palestinians and Israelis. Annexation would pose the best threat on Jordan's national security and internal security. The same thing to Egypt, same thing to the Arab world. Annexation would mean strengthening all elements in the Arab Muslim world who are extremists, who also want the conflict to be a religious one. That's a very dangerous game to play. You know, you cannot kill ideas with bullets. You cannot prevent ideas to travel with or without visas. If you want to defeat extremism in this region, and we should defeat extremism in this region, we should defeat ISIS in this region, we should defeat all those who try to use God for their political purposes and so on. And this can be done through two things. One is peace between Palestinians and Israelis. And my opinion, it's live and let live. It's a state of Palestine with East Jerusalem, its capital, to live side by side in peace and security with the state of Israel on the 67 borders. And secondly, democracy in the Arab world. And anyone who says Arabs are not ready for democracy is a racist.
Saeb Erekat, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
All right, joining me now from Jerusalem is Gerald Steinberg, who is an author of Menachen, Begin, and the Egyptian Peace Process. It was a peace process that was signed in 1979. Gerald, maybe I can ask you, and I know you're a professor at Bar-Ilan University as well, I can ask you, are there any parallels between this never-ending peace process with the Israeli and Palestinians and the deal between Israel and Egypt?
If anything, the two cases highlight the differences. Both Begin and Sadat, they were leaders of countries. They were very strong leaders. They had very clear ideas of what their interests, both their national interests and their own personal political interests were. And they were able to put the pieces together and say, okay, Sadat wants land back, wants Sinai back, and Begin wants an end to conflict and a real peace agreement. We don't have that situation. There's no real strong Palestinian leader who's able to bring about Palestinian people to agreeing to sit side by side with Israel, two states and all of that.
It does seem that there are some pretty clear demands by the Palestinians and demands by Israel. I mean, and I've always thought, I mean, I was a correspondent and I was based in Jerusalem for years, and I've always thought, why can these two sides not get it together? The Palestinians want a homeland, Israel wants security, and at one point was willing to compromise on all sorts of different peace plans that were in the process, essentially land for peace, and yet we never see it come to fruition.
It's from an Israeli perspective, from my perspective, and I think that reflects what Israelis have been voting. We had 3 elections last year and a half. They all came out mostly the same. The Israelis don't see Palestinians interested in the peace part of it. They're not interested in sitting side by side with Israel. They still have this image, goes back to 47, 48, rolling back the clock so that there is no Israel. There's no state that defines itself as a Jewish home, the nation state of the Jewish people. And that's something that the Palestinians just need to accept. Israel's not going to disappear. You can't negotiate yourself out of existence. And it always comes down to that. It always comes down to Palestinians demanding right of return for millions of what they call refugees. We're talking about 1948. It always comes down to Israel has to be a state of all its citizens and not define itself as a homeland for the Jewish people with Hebrew language and all the other things. So maybe during your time as a correspondent here, that was something that wasn't emphasized when you talk to Palestinians, but we see it all the time. We see it on.
Well, I would say a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, and then I would differ with the Hamas mainstream in Gaza, which wants to push Israel back into the sea. But the mainstream, PLO Palestinians that were living in the West Bank generally would say yes to recognition of Israel, and they have in the Oslo Peace Accords, not this complete denial of an Israeli state.
Sort of, but then when it comes down to putting it down into details, and that's where we've been since Oslo was in '93. It was the Declaration of Principles. It said we're going to establish a Palestinian Authority and we're going to negotiate the rest. So when end of conflict is the term that's been used a lot. Ehud Barak in 2000 went to Camp David with Clinton and said, okay, we're going to do lots of these concessions, security, and other things, land. We need end of conflict. And when it comes down to Palestinians saying, okay, we're not going to go demanding reversal of the 47 partition resolution, the 48 recognition of Israel, the end of the war there where Israel emerged as a viable country. That's what they can't do. The Palestinians can't bring themselves to that. Largely in their own conversations, you watch it on radio and television, you listen, you read it in the newspapers, and you see this. It's Israel is an illegitimate state. Israel does war crimes, and the whole BDS movement. It's all about erasing Israel as a legitimate country. And we see that.
It's interesting. I don't want to get into it now, but I mean, it's interesting that one of the chapters in Oslo 2, if I call it a chapter or call it one of the focuses of Oslo 2, was that they dropped this rhetoric. They stopped talking about Israel and they as a state that has to be pushed into the sea, and they stopped some of the horrible propaganda that's been on Palestinian TV, embracing and celebrating suicide bombings and different things, and then they start not programming, but informing their people about what Israel really is and how the two sides should be able to live side by side.
Well, that's maybe what you see, but we don't see it. And I don't think.
No, I say that's what it was called for in the accord, but it was never implemented.
That's right. Yeah, and we're still there. So if we're talking about 94, 95, nothing's changed since then, and it's become much more deeply ingrained. Israelis understand this is the critical issue that needs to be overcome, and we're not seeing any movement. Also,
what do you call this proposal now that Jared Kushner, who I don't think knows very much about Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all, but what do you call this deal on the table? Do you call it a peace deal?
I don't use that language. I know they do, and there are people in Israel, including the prime minister and others, who call it a deal of the century, is often used. I think it's really an attempt to move away from where we are today, where we've been stuck for so many years. It's been 53 years since the 67 war, 72 years since 1948. We're all stuck in this situation, and it's not viable. You can't maintain it this way. You don't know. When you cross over, you drive out of Jerusalem, you go in almost any direction except towards the west, towards Tel Aviv. You drive north or south or east. And where are you? Are you in a Palestinian area? Are you in an Israeli area? It's no man's land. There is no consistent legal process that goes on there. Who owns land, how it gets transferred is all very confusing. Even if you get into a car accident, where do you deal with whether it's insurance or legal process? That's just not working in the status.
All right, so this is considered to be a step. Many the Palestinians will call it a dramatic step backwards. Netanyahu thinks it's a step forward, and so does Trump, who would love to trumpet that he's brought about some kind of great agreement, and Palestinians would certainly argue that. But it's essentially, as you understand it, this is an expansion of Israeli sovereignty. And they are taking Palestinian land. They are annexing up to 30%.
Now, the question is if there is going to actually be some sort of a change in this situation, applying Israeli law or annexation or sovereignty, that's a whole separate debate. If what territory is going to encompass? Is it going to encompass just a couple of small cities that are outside of Jerusalem and a little bit further north? Not really affecting, talking about 2 or 3% of the land. There are already tens of thousands of Israelis who've been living there for dozens of years. That's not a big strategic change. A lot of this debate is more symbolic and ideological, and the language is very loaded. But
this is legal annexation. I mean, this is just not a conversation. This would be legal annexation of the Jordan Valley.
Well, if they do the Jordan Valley, and I'm guessing they're not going to do the Jordan Valley, not at this time. I think they're going to do minimal for all sorts of reasons. And as I said, a couple of the small cities that are outside of that are right on the old. Remember, there's never been any border. There's only been a ceasefire and armistice line from 1949. So these are things that have changed since 1960.
You mean like cities of like Ma'ale Adumim?
Ma'ale Adumim,
and that's how big now. That's huge, just for people that have never been to the West Bank or Israel, and they don't understand.
Tens of thousands, maybe 50,000.
Tens of thousands.
And also there are satellite. It has its own suburbs, maybe you want to say, and it's a 10-minute drive outside of Jerusalem. All the roads are connecting to it. So de facto, it really is part of Israel, except that legally, it in terms of Israeli law and in terms of other issues that have to do with status, its situation is ambiguous, and that's a constant problem.
So the Palestinians, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we move away, this is my own personal view, if we move away from the status quo that's been in existence for 53 years, and in view of many people has gone beyond what's tenable, then maybe you start a peace process. Maybe you say to the Palestinians, okay, we've all lived with this undefined situation for 53 years. It's not working. It's not working for you or for us. You Palestinians can't just say no to every other plan. You've got to come up with something that Israelis can live with. So forget about this issue of flooding Israel with millions of Palestinians that are called refugees 72 years later. Talk to us about something that is based on the status quo, that we can both live with us. Do the Begin Sadat thing. What are your core interests that we can live with? We'll tell you what our core interests are that we can live with. Let's find a package. That's not going to happen until Palestinians realize that time is working against them in a very negative way. And that, I'll say that in favor of Kushner and Ambassador David Friedman and the Trump plan, that what they've done is they've moved us out of absolutely zero, the point zero that we were in 1967. And what you
mean time is working against them because Israel continues to expand settlements while the conversation does or doesn't go on about what a final peace deal might look like.
And not only is Israel doing facts on the ground, if you want to use that term, but also we've seen that a lot of the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, other countries, Egypt for sure, want to also see some sort of agreement and are not going to continue to support an untenable Palestinian position forever. That's also
over 1,000 parliamentarians from the EU have signed an open letter expressing their opposition to Israel's plans for annexation. The head of the UN has called it, devastating effects for the region. I mean, Netanyahu doesn't have a lot of support for annexation.
Well, you've been a correspondent who what Israelis think about the UN and about the EU. That just doesn't resonate.
Not much of the UN, that's for sure, because Israel feels that the UN has always been sympathetic and leaning towards the Palestinian cause and not really recognizing a lot of the security concerns of Israel. Would you sum it up like that?
And the UN is deeply ingrained in the Palestinian narrative, the whole history of saying Israel should never have been created, all that stuff. They've placed a number of people in those positions, and we keep hearing it over and over again. The EU, 1,000 parliamentarians, and they're out of, I don't know how many there are, but also the EU doesn't do anything to help Israel strategically, doesn't deal with Iran seriously, so nobody listens to them here.
Does this destroy the notion of a two-state solution? A lot of Palestinians would say it does, and it cuts up a potential Palestinian homeland into Swiss cheese, where you really don't have a continuous area of land, but there would be Israeli settlements here and there and roads cutting them up, and even some Palestinian villages suddenly will find themselves as islands amidst an annexed Israel.
That's not going to happen, in my view. I think all those maps are not realistic. If the Palestinians have something that's going to work, put it on the table, but you can't just say no to every possible framework. They're not even engaging. There's been no serious engagement with Israel really since after Oslo. There have been bits and pieces of it, but they don't have, and there's no Palestinian discussion about, I'm talking about widespread public discussion about what sort of packages could be put on the table that we could all live with.
But isn't that because they don't feel that Netanyahu is a realistic person that they can negotiate with? I mean, after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and the death of Oslo I and Oslo II, they don't feel anything on the table is going to advance their cause. It's just going to take them backwards.
Well, the Israelis see nothing from the Palestinians that indicates that they're ever going to be interested in peace. You got to move away from both of those stereotypes. and look at reality on the ground. And if, in fact, we're going to if this process, complicated as it is, and what really is a clash on the question of whether Israel should or shouldn't extend sovereignty to certain areas, if that forces the Palestinians to go, I would say, back, they really haven't been at the table, to think realistically about a two-state solution, then in fact, instead of closing the door for a movement towards that, it opens it, because it's been closed now for at least 20 years.
Right, but forces them back. How can you force them back? I mean, they are entitled to negotiate and believe that the settlement they're going to get for their people, not under pressure, but under a long, decades, as you mentioned, discussion, will in the end bring about a realistic homeland for them. You can't force them anywhere.
The Palestinian goal is the elimination of Israel. That's the broad.
Well, you say that. I'm not sure that most Palestinians.
Look at the textbooks. You look at what they teach to their schools. You see what they say to each other in speeches and platforms and media. We got a lot more access to that than we had 30 years ago. We see it all, and I think that is very accurate. There's a new book that's out that I suggest that you and other people interested in this read. It's by Adi Schwartz and Einat Wolf. It's called The War of Return. And it documents, going back actually before 47, but mostly from 47, how the Palestinians have adopted this myth and cling to it, and how UNRWA, all sorts of UN agencies, and a large part of the Western intelligentsia have bought into this idea that the Palestinians have a case for eliminating Israel. So the Palestinians believe in this mythology. It's still deeply ingrained. They can't.
Well, I think many in Western Europe support Israel as well. But look, I'm not an academic as you are, but I have not consulted the Israeli government. But I have ridden on patrols in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with Israeli soldiers, and I have Israeli friends, and a lot of them always supported the idea of land for peace. They don't go to the West Bank. They don't go to Gaza, certainly. They would like to live a normal life inside Israel and be done with this never-ending conflict. And the idea that they can drag the Palestinians to the table and impose some kind of peace deal has been tried before, and it didn't work. And a lot of Israelis, I think, there isn't much of a left wing left anymore, but a lot of them certainly would like and embrace a peace that would allow them to live side by side with the Palestinians if the conflict would stop, if the armed conflict would stop.
If the armed conflict would stop, that's a huge, huge condition, because we have never seen it stop. We had a terrorist attack here 2 or 3 days ago, a car ramming. Before that, we have drive-by shootings. We've got it all. It's a different form, but it's still out there. It doesn't get the same media attention. Israel's gotten better at protecting its citizens against it, but you still see the hatred. You see it on an everyday basis. That's what Israelis, the term end of conflict, Israelis need to see end of conflict, which doesn't mean the end of Israel.
All right, it's always a tinderbox there. Don't you fear that if Netanyahu goes forward with this, I mean, obviously the Americans seem to be backpedaling on the length and breadth of annexation, but if they go forward with annexation, don't you feel that's just going to bring you more violence?
I think that there is a reasonable concern about that. I'll use the term stability. Israelis, like everybody else, want stability. And yeah, another round of violence, another wave of terror bombings and bus bombings and all of that is something that is of concern. And there's a lot of discussion. You hear it leaked from about security services telling Netanyahu about this. Look, I think nothing's been set in stone yet. Everything is very ambiguous. We're talking about it. So all these things have to be done very, very carefully. There are clear risks in doing what was talked about a few months ago. And I see Netanyahu, and remember, we have a complicated government now. We've got a fill-in, a stand-in for the prime minister because Netanyahu could not set up a government on his own. He didn't have enough votes. He needed Benny Gantz, former chief of staff, who's now also the defense minister, and who has, I think, a more security-based, more cautious approach to this. Things are different than sometimes they're portrayed. And I don't think we're going to see a reckless Israeli policy. Reckless would then could lead into a lot of violence. But we also have to move away from ground zero. How do we get out of the situation when we're locked in for 53 years, where Palestinians have a veto on changing anything on the ground? They're waiting for Israel to self-destruct, and we have to be careful about that, or not self-destruct, but over time, over generations, Palestinian view is it's not going to be what it is now. So Israelis, and that's why Netanyahu and people who have this view get a majority in the elections. As you said, the Israeli left is weakened. There is no real peace camp. They lost a tremendous amount of credibility. Oslo was a disaster for Israelis because it led to this massive round of violence, something we've never saw before. Israelis don't want to go back there. So you really have to have Palestinian engagement on the substance and not just on the surrounding language. Oh, yeah, we want to have two states, but we don't want you to be one of them. That's what we hear.
Gerald Steinberg, Professor of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is solvable. Don't believe otherwise. But forcing either side to accept annexation or security compromises or agreements that don't bring real peace just perpetuates violence and fuels extremism on both sides. And that makes it all the more difficult for mainstream moderates, and they are the majority, to promote and agree on peace. I'm Dana Lewis. Please subscribe to Backstory wherever you listen to podcasts and share. Talk to you again soon.